As the calendar has turned to August, the hurricane season in the Atlantic is now in a make or break period. While we are seeing conditions slowly but surely starting to improve, the El Nino is not making things easy. While we are starting to see some signals starting to pop up according to some ensembles, the question is this just noise or are these legitimate? In today's video, we're going to be going over everything you need to know about the Atlantic and why this August will make or break this hurricane season. Alright, let's get right into this. So, this is what we have going on across the Atlantic right now. Over the first couple of months, we have not seen too much activity outside of Arthur and Bertha, both in the Gulf region. However, this month, things might start getting a little interesting in a few areas. A couple of areas I am watching in particular are homegrown setup storm potential in parts of the Gulf and the east coast of the United States. I am well aware that the GFS did previously have a signal over there, had a pretty strong low pressure system off the coast of the Carolinas. That seems to me have completely downtrended at this current point in time, so I'm not going to pay really much attention to it. Also, it's most likely GFS doing GFS things anyway, so I won't be talking about that really. The other area I'm starting to watch out for is the main development region and parts of the eastern Atlantic basin, because I am noticing conditions are starting to improve over there slowly but surely. There is still a little bit of dry air that we're going to be talking about over there, but I am noticing a couple of signals slowly but surely starting to pop up over there according to the European and the European AI model. Is this legitimate or is this just more noise? We're going to investigate that first, and then we're going to go ahead and start looking at conditions and how things might start acting going forward. So starting off, I have the European AI model pulled up for you guys right here. This goes out the full 2 weeks. We're going to go ahead and zoom in over here to the main development region area, and we're going to go ahead and dissect some of this all right here. So here's what we got. Let's go ahead and go back to about 9 days out to see how things start to go off. You have a bit of a signal, relatively weak as of right now, starting to emerge in the main development region starting around August 9th. At this current point, this is early in the morning over here in the United States, a bit more into the afternoon in parts of the Cape Verde Islands, but you're looking at a relatively decent signal over there according to the European AI. Yes, it is relatively weak at this current point, but there is a lot of ensemble support for it according to this model, so definitely something to keep an eye on. We're going to go ahead and go another 24 hours out. And as you can see, it starts moving pretty far west, actually. It moves pretty quickly to the west, as a matter of fact. You are starting to notice a little bit more organization and a little bit more development according to some of these. Also noticing more ensembles starting to pop up here and there, whether it's in the central MDR or in the eastern MDR as well. So definitely something to keep a close eye on. Remaining relatively weak though, most likely due to some conditions that we're going to be talking about in just a second, as well as the fact that we're going to be cross-checking all this too. So I want to pay attention to this going forward. But let's go ahead and go out another 30 hours or so going here. This is what we got 270 hours out. This is the afternoon of August 11th. The reason we're going that far out is because the sign over there is blocking the 264-hour period. But here's what you're starting to notice a little bit of. Noticing relatively weak signal moving across much of the MDR. You are noticing a little bit more organization and development on a few ensembles right here, but nothing relatively exciting as of yet. This system's just slowly but surely chugging its way across the MDR. And then as we go ahead and go towards August 12th, noticing a little bit more of the blues over here, noticing a couple of power signals as well a bit further to the south, 998 and 1004, though its wind speed remains relatively weak, so definitely something to pay attention to and something I find kind of interesting going on at this point. And then as we go ahead and go to the 13th of August, you are noticing the power numbers starting to pick up slightly, and you are noticing some of these ensembles starting to move into the Caribbean, which I will tell you this, I've looked at the conditions over there. If it does move into the Caribbean, it's going to be running into a lot of shear, and it's not going to be lasting further, most likely, than Puerto Rico, in my opinion. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. Definitely something to pay attention to, but still looking at the power numbers, and it would have a better shot of survival if it moved towards the Atlantic Basin over here in the northwestern part of the screen. And then as we go ahead and go to 2 weeks out, according to this ensemble, definitely noticing a few things. Definitely noticing more of the power numbers starting to pick up a little bit. Not necessarily as expressive, just more so here and there. Most likely tropical storm scenarios as it heads towards parts of the eastern Atlantic Basin. So definitely something to kind of keep an eye on. Definitely has a lot of ensemble support, although the particular strength of this is relatively weak. And then as we go ahead and go towards the 15th of August, this is what we got for you guys. Right here, this is where you have your most support, I would say, at least in terms of both the power numbers and the amount of ensembles we're seeing over there. And this is kind of pretty widespread, as a matter of fact, across the MDR and parts of the basin and in the Caribbean. But let's cross-check this with the European, and let's see how realistic of a situation this could be. Here is your European ensemble right here, a bit different, I would say, compared to what we've seen previously. Matter of fact, let me go ahead and change this real quickly. This is what we have 9 days out across parts of the Euro, going on across much of the main development region. Not too much going on at this current point in time. Let's go ahead and go to 10 days out. Not too much happening over here. Let's go ahead and go to skip a couple of days right here. Noticing a few ensembles starting to pick it up a little bit more. Definitely something interesting is going on over there. It's definitely a bit of a weaker signal compared to what I've seen previously at this current point, especially from what I've seen yesterday. It's definitely weakened considerably over here. Not too much is going on. Here's what we saw with the 12Z earlier. Definitely picking up a little bit over here, but we shift over to the 0Z. Not too much has been going on. Not necessarily too surprising at this current point. Definitely something to watch over here. It's not necessarily a legitimate signal from what I've seen, but based on what I'm seeing with the AI and the Euro, also checked the GFS, cross-checked it with the DeepMind and a couple other AI runs as well. There's not too much going on in this part of the MDR, partly due to the fact that there is, even though there is weakening wind shear, you are starting to see a situation where the dry air is still taking over, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But now that I've kind of covered this, and now I've kind of cleared the bases with this a little bit. An interesting fact, though, is we do need to shift over to the Atlantic, and the European 0Z is kind of being a little interesting over here, even though the GFS kind of canceled it out, and the GFS kind of was looking at this and kind of downtrended pretty significantly. The European ensembles are still wanting something to potentially develop over here off the east coast of the United States and off the coast of the Bahamas. I do want to cross-check this with some ensembles, and just to make sure before I move forward with other things, just so that way we don't jump to conclusions, and so I can give a full analysis. So this is what we got going on over here. Let's go ahead and shift this over a little bit to the left. And as we go ahead and move forward, this is just one ensemble that I'm showing. Also going to show a few others as well. So let's go ahead and take a quick gander. Let's go ahead and go about 2 days further. Let's go ahead and go to August 9th. And this is what you're noticing. You're not noticing too many signals over here, but you're noticing the ensembles that do develop it. Maybe especially this one over here has a lot of power towards it, the 974 millibar system. This remains at this current point an outlier from what I have seen. I don't necessarily see another Isaias situation happening this year, at least for this run right here, where it heads towards the Carolinas as a strong Category 1 hurricane. And then as we go ahead and head towards 216 hours out, you are noticing some of the ensembles picking up on this, but it's not necessarily the strongest signal that I have seen according to the European, especially compared to what I've seen with the GFS and its operational run yesterday. But by and large, it's definitely something that has piqued my interest, mainly due to the proximity it has to the coast. And then as we shift further out, as we move out to sea, and as the system moves out into the Atlantic, you are seeing those ensembles still keeping it going. You're still seeing the power numbers starting to peak up a little bit, but overall, a relatively weak signal, in my opinion, a weak to moderate signal, at least according to the European ensembles. Let's go ahead and cross-check this with the European AI and the GFS. And here is your European AI run right here. You're not seeing too much happening over here in this part of the Atlantic. Let's go ahead and go to 8 days out. You are seeing a couple of ensembles, but remaining relatively weak over here, so I'm not necessarily too worried about it. 216 hours, that's 9 days out, so that's August 10th. Not too worried about it right here. And then as we go ahead and get to 240 hours out, not too much going on with that. Here's our GFS. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we had for the 0Z. Just to preface, here's what the 12Z ensembles were showing, and this is what we had going on. And let's go ahead and go to 10 days out for you guys. This is what we were seeing with the ensemble. So how the operational pulled a huge hurricane out of its butt, I don't 100% know. This is why I said this is the GFS doing GFS things right here, ladies and gentlemen. So I just wanted to take a quick gander at this. The European definitely has been aggressive with it. GFS a lot more conservative compared to what I've seen previously. So with that being said, I've looked at all of this. I'm thinking, okay, these are two relatively weak signals. I'm not putting too much stock into it, but just to entertain it a little bit, what kind of conditions are we looking at and how theoretically possible could this be? And to start off, we have our water temperatures right here in the main development region. Definitely things are getting pretty interesting, to say the very least. You're definitely looking at around 27 to 28 degrees Celsius. That's about 80 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you who do not use the metric system. And ultimately, what you're noticing is a lot of this is concentrated about 15 degrees north-south, pretty much south of the Cabo Verde Islands. You are also noticing this water temperature surge, and we've talked about this all summer. You've seen a pretty big water temperature surge across much of the Atlantic. In fact, you've seen over the last month a lot of the warmer water starting to penetrate a bit deeper into the subtropics than what we saw with June and early July. Mid to late July definitely started penetrating a bit further to the north, but look at how far east these water temperatures have expanded. Matter of fact, we're going to pull up the climate reanalyzer in a second just to show you what happened in the month of July and what's been going on in the last month. So here is the climate reanalyzer. We're going to shift over to the North Atlantic for you guys right here. We're going to look at our sea surface temperatures right here to show you what's been going on. This is what we had on the 1st of July, ladies and gentlemen, across much of the Atlantic. You had a few concentrated areas around 30 degrees Celsius, particularly concentrated in the Gulf and off the coast of the Bahamas over here. Main development region was still a little bit colder than average, but you also had this staying a bit more concentrated, a bit further to the south compared to what we've seen previously, at least according to what we saw compared to 2025. So that's what we're looking at, and that's the situation we saw on ourselves on the 1st of the month. Let's go ahead and zoom out and move through this right here, and man, oh man, a lot of the Atlantic, at least according to what we've seen, especially all summer, has been heating up. But look at how far north it has started to expand, in part because of what the Gulf Stream has been doing over here as well, ladies and gentlemen. So that's something very interesting to keep an eye on, just how far east this has expanded. This has expanded well over 500 to 600 miles to the east compared to what we've seen previously. But those sea surface temperatures alone don't tell the full story. Another thing I am noticing is the MDR is shifting at least its water temperature surge a bit further up to the north as well. So definitely something to keep an eye on and pay attention to, especially as we go into August and September. Also noticing a maritime heat wave, which is a part of it off the coast of Mauritania over here. So if any tropical waves do move further up to the north and enter that water temperature area right there, as long as it has good shear and there's plenty of moisture around it, would be a good area and a good starter package for potential tropical development. So it's definitely something we're going to want to keep an eye on, but that only tells half the story. We're going to show you the SST anomalies next as well. And here is our SST anomaly map that we have for you guys right here. This is what we saw for the 1st of July. MDR at or below average in a few spots. Mainly cold areas concentrated in the subtropics. A bit warmer concentrated in the Atlantic Basin and parts of the southern subtropical Atlantic over here. Caribbean was also at or below average in much of the central region of the Caribbean and in parts of the Gulf. You had above average across much of the Gulf, with the exception of the western coast over here. But this is how things have started to change over the course of the month. And as time has progressed, you're starting to notice a pretty big anomalous area starting to emerge near the northern tropics or southern subtropics over here in the central Atlantic, right in the middle smack. It did start to calm down a little bit and did start to cool off, but you had that maritime heat wave really starting to ramp up, and things definitely have gotten interesting. You had a point where in late July, you had a situation where a lot of the MDR went to at or above average across much of the region. You do have this Atlantic Niña that was starting to build up as well, but that's been remaining relatively weak and breaking down over the last month. That's also going to be critical in how this activity is going to be happening, because if that persists, that's going to lessen your activity pretty considerably. But as time has progressed, you're definitely noticing a lot of those anomalous areas. Let's show you this. A lot of those anomalously low areas, anomalously cold areas rather, have started to decrease pretty considerably, and it's mainly concentrated to these 3 pockets in this area off the coast of Africa over here. So how that gets mixed out and how that progresses will be interesting to see what happens later down the line with this season. But back to the Atlantic, ladies and gentlemen, looking at how things have progressed, you are noticing a bit of a cold sore over here in the Gulf. That's the remnants from Tropical Storm Bertha. Noticing a bit of a cold sore as well in parts of the northern tropics and the subtropics as well, which is pretty interesting to say the very least. Mainly because you've seen some more trade winds over there. You've seen a few storms move into the area as well. Definitely something to pay attention to because of the increase of upwelling. But across the Caribbean, a lot of the colder anomalies, with the exception of a few isolated spots, are gone. Across parts of the MDR, you are still starting to see those colder anomalies slowly creeping up, and you're seeing that happening a little bit in the parts of the Cape Verde over here, but the maritime heat wave is still persisting, and you're still seeing generally above average anomalies across much of the Atlantic. Just stuff that I want to pay attention to and stuff that I want to discuss with you guys right here. But also looking at the daily sea surface temperature map for the Atlantic, let's go ahead and pull this up for you guys. We are still 3rd warmest on record across this entire expansive area. We are still above the 2025 levels that we saw at this current point. It's definitely narrowed down a little bit, as in 2025 you had a pretty big surge in heat going into the last week of July, but we'll have to see how that continues to persist, and especially if how that persists going into 2027 with the El Nino that we have going on. So that is your water temperature. Another thing we need to look at is our ocean heat content, because the sea surface temperatures seem pretty good, but what's our fuel tank that's going to be looking like, especially going into August, September, and October? And here is our current OHC right here. University of Miami website hasn't updated in a few days. I've switched over to the official NOAA one for the time being, but here's our ocean heat content. Across much of the Atlantic, it's definitely been increasing in tandem with the water temperatures, but it's mainly been concentrated in the Caribbean, the Loop Current, the Bahamas. That's where your highest values are, and that's going to be pretty interesting, especially going into 2027, in my opinion, because from what we have seen, from all the indicators, if nothing forms in the Caribbean, if we only get maybe one named storm in the Caribbean, you're going to have a scenario where those water temperatures and that OHC is going to remain untapped. Similar to what we had in 2023 going into 2024. You had a scenario where you had a lot of storms, but not a lot of them were emerging in the Caribbean Sea, with the exception of Hurricane Idalia, which ended up hitting the Florida Panhandle, or the Big Bend region, mind you. But ultimately, you had a situation where it kind of played out for 2024, and we were looking at this at the time, and I was going, okay, if nothing happens here this year, next year things are going to be very interesting and potentially very scary. And next thing you know, we had Beryl happen, we had Helene happen, we had a lot of storms happen, and even in the Caribbean too. Same thing with 2025. Not much was going on over there until Melissa. If we have a scenario where this year not too much activity happens because of the El Nino, you're going to have a scenario where next year things might start ramping up depending on the conditions and how the El Nino responds. But by and large, this is going to be pretty crazy, and this is going to be a pretty interesting situation going forward. But looking at what we are looking at today, definitely seeing it going up in the MDR, in the Gulf, especially around the loop current. 150 OHC has been persisting in that region. Same thing in parts of the Gulf Stream over here, starting to see that OHC really starting to go up over there off the east coast of the United States. But again, OHC is only part of the puzzle. What's everything else going to look like? To that, we have to pull up our wind shear and we have to pull up our moisture component. So here is our wind shear for you guys right here that the European is pulling up at this current point. So here's the scenario that we have. We have a mixed bag with our wind shear data. Across much of the main development region, relatively weak across the board. Caribbean lagging behind because of the El Nino and the strengthening trade winds over here. You're definitely noticing a bit of shear in parts of the Atlantic Basin. Gulf is starting to become more sheary as well. So we have a bit of a mixed bag compared to what we would typically see in the Atlantic. At the Atlantic, we wouldn't see very much shear. We might see an occasional trough push down into the Gulf, but that would be about it for this part of the year. But ultimately, here is our scenario that we have going through at this current point. You have shear starting to increase across parts of the MDR. Caribbean remains stubborn as hell over here, mainly due to the El Nino factor. And you have this shear just kind of going up and down in the main development region. As we're starting to see across the Atlantic Basin, though, it does start to calm down a bit as we go towards 5 days out. So that could be a bit interesting if anything developed over there. But the wind shear has remained a pretty mixed bag, and it continues to remain a mixed bag as you're starting to see an increase in parts of the northern MDR and in parts of the southern MDR as well. And as we get towards about 12 days out, you're still seeing this Caribbean shear persisting. You're seeing the shear across much of the Atlantic reinforcing over here. So overall, not too much may be going on. And if something does develop, it's going to have to get past this shear, and it's going to have to fight this and move through it until it gets to the Atlantic Basin for anything meaningful to happen. And as we get to 2 weeks out, this is when things might start to get a little interesting. This one shear starts to get broken down and get pushed further up to the north as well. So definitely something curious is going on, but overall the shear is not the most favorable, particularly because we are dealing with an El Nino. And we'll also have to pull up the dry air aspect of this, because the dry air has definitely been the biggest thing that has made or broke a lot of things in the main development region and across much of the Atlantic as well. And for that, here is your dry air aspect of it. Sahara air layer is still pushing across much of the Atlantic at this current point in time. Not very favorable at this current point, at least for the first 2 weeks of August. Next 2 weeks, we'll have to see what happens as more data and more models progress going on. But you're seeing a lot of moisture pinting up across much of the Gulf and parts of the eastern coast of the United States in the southwestern Atlantic Basin. But in the Caribbean and the main development region, very, very dry across much of the Atlantic. So overall, with the exception of this moisture pocket that's emerging from these tropical waves, things are not seeming very cut and dry, as I would say. Cut and dry as in we're looking at tropical development, not cut and dry as it's actually super freaking dry over there. But anyway, jokes aside, at this current point in time, you're not seeing too much moisture going on across much of the Atlantic from here, although you are starting to see a little bit more of a breakdown in the Sahara air layer going into mid-August, ladies and gentlemen. You're starting to see more of it getting pushed towards Europe as well, and more moisture starting to infuse in parts of the Atlantic. We might see a scenario where we're maybe going into late August and September. You're going to have a scenario where the MDR starts opening up a little bit, and in part because of the weakening Bermuda high compared to the average thanks to El Nino, it's going to stay out of the Caribbean and maybe push into more favorable conditions in the Atlantic Basin. Only time will tell what happens, but I do want to show the anomalies for you guys right here. Things do start to get better as time continues to progress. Let's go ahead and start at where we're at now. At least according to the climatological mean, it is a bit of a mixed bag. Way more moist in much of the subtropical and northern tropical Atlantic, but where the deep tropics are and where it counts, it's still drier than average in a lot of areas over here. And as we get to about 48 hours out and past that, it gets even worse across much of the Atlantic Basin, and at least in the areas where it counts. It doesn't start to improve and it doesn't start to get better until about 7 to 10 days out. And then as we get to 10 days out, you're starting to see a bit of a moisture infusion going on across much of the western MDR, followed by a little bit of dry air. And then as we get towards mid-August, around the 14th to 15th, you're seeing a lot bigger of a moisture pocket, at least with more precipitable water compared to the mean from what we have seen compared to the average. So that's what we're seeing over here. And overall, the first 2 weeks of August do not seem the most favorable at this current point in time for tropical development. The next 2 weeks of August, however, things might start to get a little interesting if these models persist, because you're going to see decreasing shear in parts of the MDR. You're going to start seeing more moisture infusion. We're going to have to wait and see when this puppy starts opening up, and we'll continue to keep you updated and continue to pay attention to things here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. But with that being said, we are going to go ahead and close this video out right here. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. If you'd like to help out, hang out, or ask us some questions, feel free to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that will be in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.